dramatically changing field right now, I feel. So we want you to have questions. Those of you in the chat can obviously ask your questions on Zoom. If you have a question here and you're in the audience, I'd ask for you just to kind of come up and we'll put you in front of the podium and I'll give you the microphone and that way Dave can hear you. But Dave, I think I mentioned to you, we've talked a little bit about the independent contractor issue in wrestling and how that's been in the news a little bit lately. Talked about the emergence of AEW in the pro wrestling game. And I may just turn it over to you to kind of talk a little bit about any number of directions you may want this to go, whether it be your background, how you got where you are, or kind of the current scene in this industry. I've talked a little bit also about your really good analogies to the American Football League. And we've talked a lot about, monopolies getting competition and how rare that is in sports. So I'll kind of stop here and maybe let you talk for a moment, and that may stimulate some questions from the audience.
Yeah, it's probably the most interesting period as far as pro wrestling goes in at least 22 years, because pro wrestling really had not been, well, it'd been dominated by one company for so long, and it appeared that it was probably going to be like that forever, and probably would be. It took a combination of timing and timing and somebody with a lot of money who was really smart about wrestling at the same time, because there were people with a lot of money who'd gone into wrestling before and not had any success, and to come in and make it a real competitive situation. On the MMA front, it's almost different in the sense that UFC has outdistanced its competitors more and more as time has gone on. So they are the one, the number 2 MMA group is so far behind UFC as compared to the number 2 pro wrestling group, not being so far behind WWE. And obviously it's been there's a lot of changes in the business, and the future of the business of both businesses is interesting because they're basically determined by rights fees. All the other metrics that it used to be, whether it was pay-per-view, still exists for AEW, and to a degree for UFC. I mean, but ESPN's kind of the owner of the pay-per-view rights. So, and UFC kind of gets a guarantee of how much, and it's ESPN's job to promote it, and they get the first count of the money and everything like that. And with WWE, they've gone away from pay-per-view and gone to streaming, selling their stuff to Peacock. So everything about the business, both businesses going forward, is about selling your content to big boys who will pay lots and lots of money. And the question is, can you find big boys willing to overspend to start their own thing, like Peacock's doing with WWE? And you could argue ESPN did with UFC. And is that sustainable in the long run? And these large television rights fees, as television gets less and less important in our lives, will the television stations continue to have the kind of money to pay for these? So those are the big questions really that face both pro wrestling and MMA, even in the next 3 to 5 years when the next set of contracts are renewed, because you're going to look at it and just go, okay, what is this worth on the current market? As all sports and everything like that become more and more fragmented, all entertainment becomes more and more fragmented. So I think that both businesses, and boxing to a degree too, are going to be dependent on big boys, whether they be networks, whether they be large streaming services, spending money and how much money they are willing to spend to get your content. And these companies just producing content, and not necessarily even good content, just hours of content. That's what they're producing. I mean, they're just producing more and more than the public really wants to buy in most cases, because the more content they produce, the more money they can get from other companies.
Yeah, and again, anybody that has a question, we just love you to come up and we'll kind of put you off here to the side. I heard a question that I thought was really intriguing on your audio the other day. We presented in here, we kind of talked about the history of wrestling and how territories were really a thing until the mid 80s, and how the advent of cable television changed all that. And obviously Vince McMahon took advantage of that more than anyone else. AEW's revenue stream is obviously traditional television predominantly.
Yes.
With
pay-per-view probably being second. Yeah.
Yeah, but was really interesting, the question that came up was, did the market for this become apparent through streaming? Like cable TV was a big change in the early 80s. And then today we have, WWE went into streaming as their primary focus. And it became a kind of a low cost way for wrestling to enter, to at least try to build an audience. And possibly not so much that streaming revenue isn't really a thing for AEW, but could it be that the streaming platform is what created the knowledge base that AEW could succeed?
I mean, if you really look at it, I would say that you could really say that New Japan World created the platform that led to AEW starting, because the popularity of Kenny Omega coming out of the Chris Jericho match on New Japan World and the amount of business that it did in the United States, which was so surprising, opened the door for Tony Khan to go out. There's a market here. And then their ability to use streaming, the Young Bucks, Cody Rhodes, and in particular, to sell the first All In show, which was prior to AEW, and it being such a big success, absolutely turned the corner and probably helped TNT go, hey, you know what? They just did 10,000 people with no television in Chicago for a show. There may be something here, and there may be a chance to get into the wrestling game at a far lower cost than getting in with WWE. And that's what got them on the air. And then that popularity, I do believe, was the basis of the original popularity of AEW. So yes, streaming led to the television deal, no matter how you look at it. If you really look at it, yeah.
And as a sidebar, do you think the relative success, New Japan used to be on Access TV? I know those numbers weren't really publicly available. But was that any sort of a factor in the TNT? Were they aware of that, do you think? Or was that just kind of a...
I never heard anyone bring up the Access numbers. The only stuff that I remember, when I heard about the meetings, were the success of All In was definitely brought up. The success of New Japan World streaming, or popularity of Kenny Omega coming off of that, and probably some nostalgia in the sense that TNT and TBS, were built on pro wrestling, hadn't had it for decades, but they were built on it. And it was kind of like, at the time they were on, a lot of the executives at those companies really didn't want them on because wrestling had that bad stigma. But now it's almost like the wrestling stigma, I don't think, is nearly as bad as it was then, even though I don't think wrestling is nearly as popular, but the stigma is not as bad. And you have like new executives going, hey, these stations were built on wrestling, and we can get back in the wrestling game. And wrestling seems to be valuable right now, and drawing ratings. And the ratings that the wrestling is drawing for AEW and for WWE, are very good. They win their nights very often. In both cases, unless there's a major sports event, they will win the nights more often than not.
And just to kind of, I think I already know this, but it's kind of, I don't know what our group is representative of in terms of we're in the 18 to 24 demographic though. Outside of Keister rambling on about All Elite Wrestling, had anyone in here heard of AEW first? Because I know some of you mentioned you'd seen the advertisements. Just curious how many people had seen an ad or kind of was at least aware of the name AEW. Okay, so as I look around, and you can answer yes or no in the chat if you want, it looks like a little over a third of the students had heard that. Any of you heard of Kenny Omega or the Young Bucks or, Chris Jericho? Well, let me start with them. Anybody heard of any of those guys? Okay, so a few people have heard of them from where? Just from New Japan or from AEW or? Yeah, so outside of Jericho, because I started to say Jericho and then I stopped. So I think that's it. So who had heard of one of those? Kenny Omega, Young Bucks? I guess those are Cody Rhodes. Well, he's kind of WWE too. So no, nobody. Okay, who was familiar with Chris Jericho? Okay, so a few people were familiar with him, and so that's kind of interesting. And I think people are aware of that brand awareness that he brought, but I'm not sure that it's quite as well known, as it could be. Because about most of the people that are familiar with AEW, Dave, as I looked around the room, were the ones that were familiar with Jericho. Has anyone other than, well, I guess I already asked that question. Yeah, so you weren't familiar with any of the other folks that we talked about. And again, I'm hoping we get some questions from the audience here, but I know this is kind of a niche topic, so it's hard. You mentioned UFC, though, and their competition. I'm of the opinion that while WWE is doing everything they can to squash the competition they have because it's legitimate, from a legal standpoint, is it fair to say that UFC probably would like to see Bellator and ONE and some of these other organizations kind of plug along at the level of success they currently have, just to help them from an antitrust perspective?
Well, because of the lawsuit, I think they're not as intent on trying to ruin competition as they would have been 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, they were probably very similar to WWE in the sense of not wanting major competition. But the difference is, I don't think WWE, I mean, anything even small, WWE will attack to a degree, quietly. Whereas UFC, when it comes to the grassroots small companies, they definitely want them to exist because somebody's got to, there's got to be a place somewhere for people to fight and to get experience fighting, to be good enough to come and so they have people to sign. So UFC knows they need small promotions to exist. WWE believes they can create their own, by training people from the start. UFC is not going to take, all of a sudden hire a bunch of actors or football players or models and just go, okay, go in the gym and train for 2 years, and we're going to put you on TV. And WWE, that's kind of their philosophy. So UFC needs smaller promotions. WWE, you could argue, needs them, but they don't believe that they need them. They're not as concerned with keeping them alive, put it that way. Like UFC will help out a small company. They'll put small companies on their own streaming service. WWE would not do that. They did do that with some of the UK promotions, but that was a different strategy. That was basically a strategy to try to control the UK independent scene that was getting very, very popular by offering them that, that platform and then not promoting it at all. And basically, the independent scene in the UK is way down. Some of that's pandemic, but not all of it. Not even the majority of it at this point. But that, so it's a different strategy. But UFC pays, with Fight Pass, pays many promotions money to help them promote shows and to put them on the platform. And UFC sells, the streaming service, their streaming service with those small promotions. So they're in business with a lot of smaller promotions. WWE would not be like that. And AEW actually works with a lot of those companies too, but they're not really in business in the same way. It's not like that they have a streaming service and then they also put like smaller promotions on their streaming service.
Right. And so just to relate this to the class, because this is a good potential question for a quiz or exam or something, maybe someone can remind us what sport. Dave's talking about basically vertical integration, right? Vertical integration in mixed martial arts. We recall the sport that has probably the most secure or the best level of vertical integration. Baseball, right? They control the minor leagues. They have their own teams, have their own development, but they have to pay for that, which they may not prefer to do. And UFC, working with some of these smaller promotions, people are going to develop fight skills. It's not an art, it's a sport. So they're going to develop those at whatever place they choose to, and you want to have that level of talent coming up. Pro football, obviously, and to a lesser degree, pro basketball has the college system to develop talent for them through vertical integration. And again, they don't have to pay for it. It's a vibrant sport in and of itself. And the nice thing about that is obviously it has a much more passionate fan base of people that are going to follow their favorite college players when they go into pro football particularly, or pro basketball, or whatever it might be. And here, good. Some people got that in the chat. And again, I would ask people if you're even like want to have questions, we can go a number of different directions. I know some of you are studying journalism. I mean, Dave had started in the kind of traditional, come on down. You don't have to raise a hand. While he's coming down, Dave, I was just real quickly going to ask, Invicta is a company here out of Kansas City. It's a female fighting promotion.
Right.
Is UFC in partnership with them? Do they have ownership? I don't know the specifics.
Access owns, Anthem owns Invicta, and they're on Access TV now. UFC was working with them, and there was a point where UFC was in negotiations to buy them, and I think that there was it may have been the antitrust case itself where UFC kind of thought we probably shouldn't be buying a smaller promotion right now because of the lawsuit. So they didn't pull the trigger on that sale, and then Anthem bought them, and now it's Anthem programming. Yeah.
Okay. We'll turn the mic over here, Ryan. Go ahead and introduce yourself. If you don't mind.
Oh, okay. My name's Ryan Young. I'm a senior. My question just has to do with the fighter pay in UFC. Just because there's been a lot of discrepancies, I feel like, a lot with it. So, like, for example, Misha Tate, she came out and had a story written about her where she was talking about fighter pay and saying, like, so much money was given to us, but then again, we have to pay all these trainers and different pieces for her team to be able to go and compete. And then she only ends up with a couple grand after her entire paycheck. But then we've also had some other fighters like Kevin Holland, who recently also talked about saying, like, you need to stop complaining about, like, the fighter pay. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on, like, kind of where this goes and, like, what fighters are going to have the most influence on it. And obviously Dana White's put his opinions in there too. So, yeah.
Well, as far as fighter pay goes, I mean, there's the money is goes to either one or two things. It either goes to expenses or it goes to profits. UFC is incredibly profitable because they don't put as much money into expenses, and a key expense is fighter pay, and they budget for 16 to 20% of their revenue going to fighter pay, which, in a lot of the bigger sports, in boxing, it's much larger. In other MMA companies, it's much larger. In WWE, it's actually much lower. But the key is that, UFC is owned by Endeavor. Endeavor is losing incredible amounts of money, except for UFC, which is making an incredible amounts of money. So Endeavor, endeavors to make as much profit from UFC to prop up the rest of their money losing businesses. And by doing so, the people who get screwed, you could argue, are the fighters. Because if it was just the UFC profit loss, UFC could triple everyone's pay and still be wildly profitable. But they don't, because Endeavor as a whole is still a money losing company. And so they're not raising fighter pay. And I mean, it's a great business model. All the boxing people who complain about it, boxing promoters who complain about it, are jealous that they're able to get away with doing this. Of course, they should pay more if you look at, especially because of the damage that the fighters take. It's a very brutal sport. A lot of physical damage, a lot of mental damage as well, and short careers and things like that. It's a sport where only the top guys really come out good. The rest of them are going to be, maybe break even, and then come out of it, 35, 37 years old with broken down bodies. And in some cases worse than that. So it's a meat grinder for sure. And I mean, fighters should make more, but that's the reason that they don't, and is because they've just been able to get away with not paying them more. And there's no competition, whereas in boxing, all these different promoters are in competition to get the big fights. With UFC, they pretty much control it, so they can, it's like you really can't go somewhere and make more money. A few guys in Bellator perhaps, but for the most part, Bellator's, not doing so well to the point where they're like rating UFC for big talent. So the talent, it's kind of like take it or leave it. And with a lack of leverage, which with free agency in sports, in regular sports, you've got some leverage. You can play this owner against this owner if you're a star and things like that. And in mixed martial arts, you really don't have that leverage much. Even a McGregor doesn't. His leverage is either I fight or I don't. But with the way that the UFC's business is, with the money guaranteed from ESPN, UFC is not going to live or die based on McGregor. Like before ESPN, yes, a guy like McGregor was worth a ton because he drove so much money. But now the money he drives goes to ESPN, not even UFC for the most part. Only the live gate goes to UFC. So So even his leverage is not what it once was.
My other question was about boxing. And just as of recently with like the Tyson Fury Wilder like trilogy kind of over. Um, and obviously now Fury's kind of, we've heard reports about him looking to like unify all the belts. Yeah, if he goes and does that, like what do you think the effects on boxing will be?
I don't know that that fundamentally changes boxing. It certainly gives him a lot more leverage if he has every championship in the heavyweight division. I think he has more leverage with more promoters because they can't, well, I can use this guy's world champion and get a world title match without him. So, I mean, from his standpoint, and it's historically very significant because it's so hard to do because the promotions don't want it to happen. But yeah, if you're a fighter, being, it's good for you business wise, but it's and great for your legacy to do that.
See, you always think it's going to wait. Just as a complete sidebar, I may have mentioned this in class before, but if anybody has access to the Muhammad Ali documentary on PBS, I'm only a couple hours into it, but it's really fantastic, and it's about a lot more than sports, obviously, social issues and a lot of things that were happening in the 60s and beyond. But something I'd highly recommend, and it does give you. We talk a lot about different sports popularity. It's hard to for us, even for me to some degree, although I lived through part of this, to grasp, how much boxing and horse racing in particular have slipped in popularity compared to where they were in the days of three network television broadcasts. And the boxing heavyweight champion of the world was probably the biggest name in sports. And that's not the case today. But Dave, you did mention the change, and I talked to the class a little bit about the change with ESPN getting the revenue from the fights, and they pay a set fee to UFC, which they don't seem to. Certainly, they shouldn't have to pay more, but they've never really gotten involved with directly negotiating with fighters. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the length of that contract and if that will change where eventually maybe some of the biggest star fighters will have a little bit more leverage than they currently have based on some sort of change, whether it be ESPN changing their attitude about paying fighters on the side or coming up with a renegotiation with UFC?
Yeah, I think the current deal's in place till 2025. And at that point, I mean, the thing is that because ESPN gets the pay-per-view money, a guy like Conor McGregor is very valuable to them. He's valuable to UFC to a degree as well, but more to ESPN. But UFC is the one who pays him. So it would make sense that if Conor McGregor has a contract issue, that ESPN would maybe kick in money, since, that would just make business sense for ESPN because the more Conor McGregor fights. But, again, fighters have a short shelf life. And I don't know how much longer, McGregor's shelf life is. I mean, he's lost a lot of fights. He's not the fighter he once was. And, one or two more losses. And is he really going to be worth that kind of money when he fights on ESPN? Are people still going to pay for his pay-per-views at $1.5 million clip? I think one more loss, and, again, he's got the broken leg, and coming back from that's going to be a chore. And I don't see him beating top fighters anymore. So I think that by 2025, I think McGregor's not even going to be an issue. Now, will somebody come along? Perhaps, but those guys don't grow on trees, and it's not like you can create them. It's timing and charisma and, right guy in the right place at the right time with the right ability to talk and be able to fight, that's all plays into it. And, if you can't, a promotion can push a guy, but they can't create it. The guys either, I don't say they either have it or they don't, because a promotion can hold them back. But But you can't make them. You can't, I mean, you can't just go, hey, we've got Amanda Nunes and she's the greatest female fighter of all time. And she's exciting and this and this and this. You should buy her pay-per-views. And, but people don't, so that's kind of, it's a certain charisma and drawing power. And, so if that person comes along, yeah, for ESPN, they'd be very valuable. But after McGregor and John Jones, there isn't, Masvidal to a degree, but he's another one who's been losing. So they're long term, I don't see anybody. I mean, someone will probably come because it always happens that way. But right now, there really isn't that young guy on the rise. And that would be the guy who would be the one that you really want, if you're ESPN, you really want to get behind. I mean, I know they certainly got behind Israel Adesanya. And then guys like that on the way up are the ones that are going to be the ones that are most interesting to watch.
And just again, to share with the audience, I'll listen to Dave and his co-hosts audio after all these UFC fights. And I follow like the top fighters. I may not listen to the critiques of some of the undercard or what have you, but they will always talk about the quality of the fighter. And then frequently they'll talk about like the post-match interview. If they get up there and say, well, I'll fight whoever they give me, and they have no little bit of trash talk or personality to show. There, the mic popped out on me for a second. They may not have had such a good night because it's all about their future, revenue potential and how much they can drive demand. And again, we talked a lot about everybody in here knew but nobody liked them. But they really don't care if you like them or not. If you're interested in them, and particularly if you're paying money to watch their kind of relatively legitimate boxing matches, I guess. Whereas tomorrow, we're going to all go to the K-State game, or most of us will, and we could have the most boring game plan in the world. And for the most part, if we beat Iowa State, our fans are going to be really excited, and we're going to come back. And it's not so much about how the game plays out, or even if the coach after the game gives kind of like, oh yeah, a nothing happening press conference. That's really not that big of a deal. It's nice to have that extra spice in the rivalry, but it really is kind of the side dish as opposed to in fighting, and where you have to make your name. You want people to remember you. So it's really interesting, like the pro wrestling perspective on things, and I think this is where it comes from, because that's all about people who are able to build their own brand. Really gives you an interesting view at legitimate sports and things of that nature. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Again, we'll address any questions from the Zoom or from here. As I said, Dave, I might have you talk just a little bit about any advice you'd have for folks if they consider a journalism career, because I know if nothing else, you were always very nimble in terms of kind of not being beholden to what you'd already been doing.
That's so tough because it changed so much. When I was younger, it was all about getting a steady job with a newspaper, and that doesn't really exist now. There's very few of those jobs, and websites they're just not steady at all. It's like, I'm so glad that I have my own deal and I don't have to rely on somebody else, because, I'm not someone who would want to bounce from place to place to place. I mean, I guess, but that's what you would kind of have to do. But as far as like, I would study really hard in journalism and try to be good. But the weird thing now is so much of it is about, personality and somebody creating you and saying, hey, we can make this person a star reporter, as opposed to actually being a good reporter. I mean, and I know good reporters who are just getting by, and I know star reporters who aren't even good reporters that are making, ridiculous amounts of money. So it's almost like the pro wrestling world in a lot of ways. It's about creating a personality and a brand. And to me, that's very dangerous in journalism, because when it becomes all about you and creating a brand, I don't know that your honesty with the public is going to be all that strong. And to me, that's the strongest thing for a journalist, is to be always honest to the public at all times. And that's not rewarded anymore. And it's not really understood even. I think that people expect journalists to be, homers or bias or whatever. And even if they're not, they project that they are. And it's it's really hurt. I think it's hurt the industry greatly.
I was speaking there, Dave. Sorry, I forgot I was muted. I was just saying, we have a very attentive audience, but this isn't their wheelhouse maybe to ask. Oh, good. Come on up, ask a question. Yeah, I had a question, but I'd rather go with the audience here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm a senior in sales. I was just kind of wondering, what kind of effects do having people like Dana White's name be really well known, or having Joe Rogan calling, or just some of those big names, like, does that have a big effect for the UFC? Do they intentionally try to get everyone to know those names? Does that draw interest into the sport?
Well, Dana White is a great fight promoter, and because he's very aggressive, he talks to the media a lot. He says stuff that's quotable. Everybody listens to what he says. Sometimes they get really mad at what he says because he's a shoot from the hip guy who's going to say things that sometimes come across bad, sometimes come across great. But and he's very, very controversial in a lot of ways because he doesn't have a filter, because he's a rich guy who basically thinks that he's above it, so to speak. And, you can all run him down and he's still going to be there tomorrow, and he knows it. He'd have to do something incredibly, incredibly stupid to get nailed. And he's done some things that could get him nailed that it's had no effect on him. And so, as far as you want a strong front man, because he's always going to be there. There's people who will argue that they make Dana White the star and not the fighters. And it's like, well, Dana White is always going to be there, but there is no mistaking, and they know it, that nobody buys a pay-per-view and nobody watches a television show to see Dana White fight or talk. They buy it to watch the fighters. So the fighters are still the prime commodity, but Dana White's the guy there selling the fighters, and he's generally very good at it. So that is his strength.
Just to follow up on that, this mic took a second. I'm sorry. I guess it's maybe not as prevalent as it was, but one thing that kind of, I'm as many folks, I used to watch WWE. I really do not at this point, really at all. I'd probably count on 30 to 45 minutes that I've watched since the pandemic of live programming that they've had. Dana White does put himself out there, but it's still, there's no illusion that he's going to actually fight. He does, I would argue, a good job of promoting the fighters as stars. How would, and this is a bit of a softball question maybe, how would you rate, WWE and AEW, I guess, in terms of promoting their performers as stars as opposed to secondary to the company or to a Dana White type?
I mean, WWE, aside from Roman Reigns, pretty much, and Lesnar, Brock Lesnar, pretty much promotes the brand. It's very much like when they come to your town, it's WWE coming. AEW is the same way. I think that the promotion is kind of like this package of AEW. They absolutely try to make stars, but it's, and CM Punk, when he came in, was a big star without a doubt. And Sting to a lesser degree because of the, he's older and everything, but they try to do it. They know it's their bread and butter, but it's, and they're stars within their fan base and within their universe. They have many, many stars and they've done a great job of promoting them. But the idea of getting them to be stars outside of their fan base it's just so difficult. And so I can't say that they're doing I can't, say like, well, they should be doing it better, because it's just not easy to do. You almost, almost by being in AEW, you're limiting your exposure. It's kind of like the biggest star in Bellator. AJ McKee, and he's not a star in any real world sense, even though he wins all his fights and he's, very charismatic because of the platform. And WWE's platform isn't the strongest either. It's not like in the 80s when you had Hulk Hogan and you were on NBC and things like that. And the 90s when you were, at Austin and you were doing giant ratings, as opposed to now where you're doing healthy ratings. It's harder just because of how fragmented entertainment is now. It's harder to be that mainstream person, like in another generation where, you had your mainstream stars that everybody in the culture knew, you talked about with Ali, it's like, I can't imagine anyone, no matter what, being 1/10 of what Ali was in boxing. I mean, Tyson Fury could win every single fight. He'll never be what Ali is because the platform isn't there. With Ali, I mean, it was like, that's the biggest star in sports, and even the biggest star in sports doesn't mean what it was, because sports is much more fragmented aside from the NFL, as far as like interest level and everything goes. I mean, I don't think, maybe even LeBron as a star is not in the level of Jordan as a player. You're talking a different thing, but as far as like a guy who every single person in the culture knows, Jordan was way ahead of him because, there were fewer entertainment options and more people would watch, Jordan play than would watch LeBron play.
And just getting back to that, and again, if anyone has a question, just come on down at any time or put some in the Zoom. I don't mean to monopolize this, but getting back to the Ali documentary, if you get a chance to watch it, was a PBS Ken Burns broadcast. Like, I watched his interviews leading up to the Sonny Liston fight and before and after, and all in the Henry, the British guy, I forget now.
Henry Cooper.
Sorry.
Henry Cooper, maybe?
Henry Cooper, yeah. You watch those interviews and it's like, it takes you back for 2021. And then you think about what it would be like in 1961, 1962, whenever exactly that was. It's amazing. I mean, his presence and his charisma is just so ridiculous. It's and I lived through Muhammad Ali and Howard Cosell a little bit, but not very, very vaguely. It's just a fantastic show to watch. Dave brought up some things, and just again, and maybe he'll be interested in this too. Who is familiar with CM Punk? Anybody heard of CM Punk? Oh wow, okay, like over half. Did any of you know he's in AEW now? One person. Okay, so I don't know how they're able to get that out there, but I guess it sounds like that like was twice as many people as familiar with Jericho. Does anyone know that Shaquille O'Neal wrestled in AEW? He did. It was pretty cool. Yeah. Nobody knows though. What about that Mike Tyson has appeared in AEW? Nobody. Jorge Masvidal is going to appear in AEW tonight, I believe, on television as at the ringside. If you want to watch on TNT. Anybody knew that? Now you do. You might watch. Oh, you knew that already, Ryan? Okay, were you going to watch or probably not? Actually, if you watch anything on AEW tonight and you can tell me I'm an idiot on Monday, go to YouTube at 8:00 instead and watch the opening match they're going to have on YouTube.
9:00. Oh wait, yeah, 8:00 Central. You're right. Sorry.
Yeah. It's going to be Bryan Danielson and Minoru Suzuki, and I don't know. I mean, I'm like nerd.
It's going to be that's going to be an incredible match.
Yeah, if you don't like it, I'll give you one of my gift cards or something on Monday. You can get after me because I'm pretty convinced it's going to be fantastic, not just to people that watch it, but that are new, that are fans. But if you're new to it, I think these guys will suck you in pretty quickly. Again, I'm hoping to get questions from the audience, and we're getting 10 more minutes. Dave, and there's a lot of places I could go with questions for you, but how do you, and I know this is a tough, and I keep looking over here and I think you've got a question, but no, you kind of halfway get up. Well, if you kind of have a question, kind of try to verbalize it. It's better you than me. And then, yeah, if it's a little awkward, that's okay. Dave used to do call-in shows with wrestling fans. He's dealt with some people that can't express themselves very well at times.
Hi, my name's Kenny. I'm a senior in marketing. The reason I was slow to come up was it's a little off track a little bit, but I was just more curious about your journalism career and nowadays, with the rise of just how accessible all the information is online. Like, where do you get most of your primary research from?
I mean, most of my primary research I do myself. And then, you have as far as like news stuff, I have contacts with everybody. So that's part of it. But yeah, it's a completely different way of doing things. I do things completely different than I did even 10 years ago. I mean, as far as gathering information and stuff, I mean, I go to Twitter and then I look, and if it's something that's interesting me, then I'll start asking questions about it. But, and sometimes it's just there. Sometimes it's just like, oh, this guy's wrestling here on this day. And this guy's coming to this company and everything. And it's just right there. So yeah, it's a very different animal. I mean, it in the long run, I mean, because of the easier access to information, I consider it a positive, but there's, I mean, it's a positive, but it's, it absolutely has its drawbacks. I mean, I would hate to be a celebrity now because, I mean, if you have mental health issues and you're a celebrity, social media will kill you. And it's a sad thing. And I've seen it happen, with people, whether there's, at any level of celebrity, not even big level of celebrity, because there's just a very, there's a toxic level there, and it can override the fact that most people are probably very pleasant and, and all that, but you don't see them. You see the negatives more than the positives.
And just before we get to our next question, I kind of mentioned this in passing, I think, to the class, but one of the things the Observer does is I wouldn't say the only legitimate, because like I go to Waterloo to the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, and there are other Hall of Fames out there, but the most legitimate Wrestling Hall of Fame that's modeled after the Baseball Hall of Fame. And it gives more legitimacy to a sport / business, whatever you want to call pro wrestling, that didn't always have legitimacy in any way. And so the fact that we kind of have, and Dave's not the only one, but a reporter of record for wrestling, is for people like myself that are interested in it and follow it, it makes it a much more enjoyable and meaningful experience to have kind of that real information out there. So anyway, we'll go to our question now.
Yeah, hey, it's Zach again. I was kind of wondering, this is also just a little bit off, but you kind of touched on this earlier. Who would you say are the pound for pound greatest of all time with the UFC and with boxing? And then kind of,
I'm not enough of an expert on boxing. I mean, of the guys I've seen, it's hard. I think that Floyd Mayweather was phenomenal as just a pure boxer. But I mean, as far as MMA, the greatest fighters, I would say. So you got kind of two categories. I kind of have my non-drug test failure category, which would be like George St. Pierre, and then the drug test failure category. And sometimes you go like, maybe they should be eliminated because of that, is like, that would be like John Jones or Anderson Silva. But they would be, I would say, as far as overall, those would be the names that I would think of the most. Yeah.
and then as far as like popularity to the sport and stuff, do you think that it's getting harder for a star to bring this intense popularity, or do you think McGregor proved that maybe it's getting easier with just social media and everything?
I think it's harder, but if you really click, your upside is greater. I think the same thing about the pay-per-view industry in a lot of ways. Like, the pay-per-view industry is much harder now than it was 15 years ago or 10 years ago. But if you have the right attraction, you will do more business now than you would have ever done. Like the right, if you had a equivalent to a Mayweather De La Hoya fight, like that once every 20-year fight type of thing. They did a giant number for their time, but Mayweather ended up doing bigger number with Pacquiao, and he ended up doing a bigger number with McGregor than both of them than that fight. So the giant fight with the right personalities will do umpteen times more now than ever before. But random monthly pay-per-view is going to be more difficult than like 10 years ago.
And we have probably time for one last quick question, if anybody has it. Oh, Ryan, yeah. And those of you in the chat, we are doing the poll for bonus points. who's going to win tomorrow between K-State and Iowa State and by what margin. So to show you're still paying attention, go ahead and answer that in the chat. If you're here, you shouldn't have to do it in the chat because you should have it on the sheet of paper. But if you haven't got the sheet of paper, we'll let you know. All right.
So I know that you kind of talked about Israel Adesanya being like the next big like superstar, but like after him, like who I guess do you see right now as like the next guy? Like, do you think like Islam Makhachev is that guy to like?
He's a
bring, like,
great,
that-
he's a great fighter, but it's like, I haven't seen him break through. I remember when, the one who last year looked like he might break through was Chimaev, but he hasn't fought because he got such a bad reaction to COVID. But he looked like he was like on fire. But those guys, they have to win a championship, and then maybe. I mean, the guy who I think, even though he's not a champion, that I think is unbelievable is Max Holloway. As far as, and he's been around for a long, long time, but he's still young because he started so young. So he's a guy. But he's also in a lighter weight class. In lighter weight class, your success usually fades at a younger age than in a heavier weight class, because lighter weight class is so much speed and reflexes, and that goes. And your light heavyweights and heavyweights, so much is power, and power stays longer. So, the bigger fighters have more longevity generally. Like you see, like Blachowicz is not a young guy, and he's, tops in the light heavyweight. Stipe is not a young guy at all. He was champion. Even Ngannou's in his 30s, it's not like he's in his 20s or anything. So, and there's really not a lot of good heavyweights, on the way up. But yeah, Makhachev's certainly one of those guys. But if he gets to the championship level, will he? Khabib had it, but Khabib, it was short. You know what I mean? Like, he got there and people just got behind him, and then he got out of the business. And probably smartly. Got out undefeated, got out without ever being hurt. Got his big paydays with McGregor. So he and now he can. He's got celebrity status and everything like that in Russia. So kind of like a national hero almost.
All right. And that's probably a good place to wrap up with a very kind of an outlier of a fighter in Khabib in terms of the way he's handled a lot of things. Again, Dave, it's always a thrill to have you. I really appreciate your time. I'm probably going to throw this up on YouTube unless you have any objections to that.
No problem.
And
Of
yeah,
course.
so that way, and I will make this available to everybody in the class, but I know he can't see you, but let's thank our speaker again. All right. Thanks again, Dave. Everybody, Monday, we've got the PowerPoint posted. We'll start talking a little bit about gambling on sports and things. So, thanks.